Welcome to episode 11 of Living in Recovery, a podcast devoted to sharing the stories of fellow CBP employees who are living in recovery with an addiction. The focus of this podcast is to share the experiences of those who have struggled with alcohol or drugs in the hopes of breaking the stigma that's often associated with addiction. Also, the goal of this podcast is to stimulate hope amongst those who may be struggling but are discouraged or intimidated by the prospect of seeking help. As a disclaimer, the words expressed in this podcast are based on personal experiences alone and are not meant to be taken as medical advice or to promote one method of treatment. Today, Kimbra shares her recovery experience and how treatment helped her come to terms with her addiction. Now Kimbra discusses what works in her approach to recovery. Kimbra, when did you first know that you had a problem?
That's an interesting question. I wasn't really prepared for that question. I started comparing the way that I used substances with other people in my family who had problems when I was really young. And so I grew up around it. I grew up around people that were addicted to alcohol and other substances. And so I compared, how drunk I got compared to those that I was used to seeing inebriated. And I would say that became real apparent to me in my teens and in my early 20s. Noticing that some of the things I did were like what my family members did.
Like you had that built-in foundational understanding of what it looked like for you because of what you've seen.
Yeah, and I judged that really harshly. So that wasn't something I didn't wake up one day and say, boy, I sure hope I grow up to be an alcoholic like my mom,
Mm-hmm.
So there were warning signs, mostly because I didn't want to be like that. Yet I could see that I was doing some of the same things in my teens, late teens and early 20s.
What thoughts and feelings did you have when you realized that alcohol was an issue?
Well, I think with all substance use, with my experience is that most people have a lot of shame around it. When I started to recognize, like I said, that there were behaviors that were very much like what family members were doing that I had harshly judged, I, of course, wanted to keep it a secret. And so I blamed other people and things and circumstances for whatever I was doing that I viewed as wrong. And I think that's a really common trait with folks that have an addiction as well. We look at everything and everyone else but ourselves to explain away why we're doing what we're doing. And one that I was famous for was, I grew up in a pretty abusive household. And so I blamed what I had been through on my need to numb out.
So it was easy. It was already a built-in. You already felt like, well, it's, I've already been through this, so I know what this looks like.
Yeah, that describes it pretty well. I mean, again, always comparing myself and not wanting to be like that, not wanting to, I'll put it this way. I didn't have an understanding of the disease of addiction when it was happening to me. And so therefore, I didn't also understand the addiction and its nuances with my family members. I was still in the pain of growing up in an addictive family, experiencing all of the traumas that happened as a result of having a mom that was completely out of it most of the time when she was trying to raise us kids. So I didn't understand or make sense of the things that were painful in that childhood. Neither did she. It was much later that my mom actually did something about her problem and wound up in recovery herself. But as a kid growing up in that, environment, you know, I did what most kids do. I wanted my home life to look like what I thought my friends' home life looked like. And mine didn't, you know, like I didn't want anyone to come to my house and see what my mom was like after school, you know. And so, yeah, there was a lot of secrecy and shame and hiding what was really happening. And then when I started using substances myself, you know, I found a group of kids that were doing the same thing. And some of them had the same type of home life, you know, had lots of dysfunction in their families as well. And so I think that's an interesting thing as a parent, is that our kids will go to school and gravitate toward the kids that they can relate to. And if they're growing up in a really messed up, dysfunctional family, they'll gravitate and find the other kids that they can relate to. And that's exactly what I did. So,
how did you know it was a problem for you? At what point did it become evident that this may be an issue for me?
well, now this is I don't know how unusual this is, but I think this is probably pretty common. For me, the reason I used was because I was in pain. And I had a lot of skewed opinions of myself. Having grown up in an abusive home, I had really, really poor self-esteem. I didn't like myself. You know, when a person's abused on some level, especially when you're young and don't have the development, the understanding to differentiate between this is right or this is wrong, I believed that I was a really bad little girl because of the treatment that I received from my mom. I didn't grow up thinking my mom's wrong for treating me this way. I believed I was really bad. And she's spanking and losing control and beating me because I'm really bad. And so when I started using substances at about 13, I was trying to soothe and manage the pain that I felt. I hated myself, and I believed that I wasn't worthy of love and friends and feeling cared for and feeling safe. And so, you know, for me, the substance was to numb that pain and a way to escape that sort of existence. And what ended up happening was I started contemplating and thinking about killing myself. And the first time I was aware of that happening, I was about 19. And it went from being a thought to I started obsessing about ways to kill myself. And that went on for a number of years. And I knew it wasn't normal. That, you know, but I wasn't talking to anyone about it. I never shared that with anyone. But I knew that something was wrong with me, that I was thinking like that. And I didn't put two and two together, that the use of the substance was actually, you know, it's fair to say I was depressed, and that substance, the depressants I was taking, was actually increasing my level of depression and adding fuel to that fire that was already going on with my mental health and wanting to end my life because of the pain I was feeling. So, and I can only tell you that because I've done a lot of work to understand what happened, and also done a lot to educate myself about the disease of addiction. And that is a very common issue that people have with substance use, is that it's a hardcore depressant. I was using primarily opiates and prescription pain medication and alcohol, and the combination of those, you know, it's just a depressant on top of a depression. And it really did help me spiral into that place of hopelessness and sadness, chronic sadness, I didn't have a vision of how to get out of it. And I didn't put the two things together, that it was the substance that was making me feel like that. I mean, I had that pain. The original pain was there, but the substance was fueling that feeling of hopelessness. And I couldn't have known that until I stopped doing it, until I stopped using substances. So that was what got my attention, not the substance use, but the unintended consequence of suicidal ideation.
What made you decide to get help? You talked about, suicide.
Yeah, that was actually it. Just this feeling like something has got to give. I'm either going to accomplish this mission that I have in mind, or I'm going to have to get help. And I had, interestingly, at the same time in my life, one of my friends, I say that with air quotes because she wasn't truly a friend, but she was a using buddy. She was someone that I used and drank with, and she had gotten a DUI and she had mandatory meeting attendance. So she had to go to her NA meetings and get a slip signed for her DUI as a part of her deferred prosecution. And she knew that my mom was in recovery, and she asked me if I knew where there were meetings. And I did know where they were. And so I offered to go to one of the meetings with her. So I found myself with this friend. I'm just there to support my friend. I'm not here because I have a problem, but I went, and that was my first introduction. And it was a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. And part of the reason why I chose that was that my mom was going to AA, to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I really didn't want to go to the same meetings that my mom was going to, even though I was just going with a friend, not going for me, just going with a friend. And so that was my first exposure to 12-step recovery. And I went a couple of times with her. And I remember hearing people share things in those meetings that made me feel like, wow, that, they're describing what I feel. But of course, I kept that a secret. One of the things that really impacted me, and it's a weird little thing, is there was a sign on the wall, a little tiny sign. It wasn't any bigger than this. And it said, "Alcohol is a drug." And that stuck with me. That sort of hit me in the head like a hammer. Because in my mind, alcohol was just, everybody drinks, don't they? And I didn't want to view it in the same category as other substances that might be illegal or whatever. I didn't have a sense of or understanding of addiction. And the fact that most of us who suffer with it, it really doesn't matter what mind or mood altering chemical you put in there. Like, I am going to abuse and want more of it, because what my goal is to change how I feel with a substance. I don't like how I feel, and I'm going to put this on top of what I'm feeling to change how I feel. And whatever happens as a consequence of that is just, well, that's what we'll deal with. So that was my first exposure. And then actual treatment for me, back in those days, treatment wasn't all that common. There were treatment facilities. It was in the early 80s, but it was pretty new. So what I did instead was I found myself a therapist. And I didn't stop using immediately after that first meeting. It took a little while before I got serious about it. And then once I did pick a date and stop and have some, period of abstinence where I could look back and see, okay, I'm 60 days into this. I'm definitely starting to feel some better, but I still didn't know how to live my life without a substance on board, because I had no clue how to manage any of my emotions without using drugs and alcohol. So
You were so young at the time to have that much forethought and have that impression just from those few meetings you initially attended. I mean, to think that you did all that when so many people that age are just starting to drink more, they're increasing their alcohol intake in general, and you're doing the opposite.
Yeah. Not an easy path either.
I can't imagine it would
Very
be.
very lonely path. I actually don't think that wouldn't have been my experience had I not been so desperate to address, like, I literally felt like I am either going to kill myself or I've got to stop. I've got to do something to change how I feel. And, it wasn't as simple at, like, putting a substance on it changes things almost immediately. Well, healing is a whole nother matter. So having to approach what's wrong in here with a path to healing, like, that's going to take some time. And, I think what an alcoholic wants is instant relief. And that's why we're so prone to doing what we do with substances, is we love that instant relief. And the instant relief was going to end up killing me because I was determined. And I was also, embarrassed at how I lacked the courage to actually do it, because I had been planning and contemplating for years at that point. And, if there had been Google at that time, I was doing a lot of research on how I could pull that off and be successful. And I just lacked the courage. My final plan was, there was a place that I had driven erratically often. And if there was a cliff along this corner that I was pretty convinced if I drove my car off that cliff, it would kill me. And then there was a thought that, well, what if I didn't die? What if I just really screwed myself up? And, then I had to live with this, this hate for myself, plus be deformed because I had done something stupid to myself. And so I felt pretty trapped. Like, I had to do something. And also I do think, Stephanie, that it helped that I had that horrific example in front of me. Like, I was so, more than anything else, I didn't want to be like my mom was. And I kind of could see the writing on the wall. Like, I was heading right there. And so I think that helped too. I think that that's what really propelled me to have the courage to do something different.
Yeah.
And I met the right people. Isn't that always the truth, right? When this, what do they say? When the student's ready, the teacher appears. So the right people came into my life, and the right kind of exposure happened. I got a glimmer of hope in those first couple of meetings by hearing people share that, their life was better. And, on some level, I wanted to believe that mine could be better too. That was the start of a long-term therapy. Off and on, I did therapy for many, many years, because it sort of comes when you've got childhood trauma to heal, and also had some trauma in adolescence. I had to sort of do it in phases, and it would come up when it was time to do the work. And, like I said, I had a good therapist on staff that I could go back to when I was ready to do another batch of work, and so incredibly grateful that the right people were in place when I was ready.
And do you think the therapy, those people, and did you go back to those meetings as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
I continued to be involved in Narcotics Anonymous. And again, I related to the literature in Narcotics Anonymous. I think the name Narcotics Anonymous is confusing to people because it makes you think that you must use narcotics to fit there. But the truth is, Addicts Anonymous is what they wanted to call it, but they couldn't use AA because it was already being used. But the literature in Narcotics Anonymous says that we are powerless over our addiction and that our lives have become unmanageable. So essentially, it didn't matter what substance we were using. It fits there in Narcotics Anonymous, whereas Alcoholics Anonymous focuses on one substance. And so I think that's why I was compelled to lean toward Narcotics Anonymous, because I used all kinds of substances, and alcohol was consistent with everything else I used, but I was willing to change how I feel with anything. I was desperate to change how I feel with anything. And so for me, the recovery has been complete abstinence from all mind and mood altering substances. And that fits really well with the message of Narcotics Anonymous. So.
How many years did that go on before you felt like you were in true recovery? When could you say, I think I'm in recovery, and what does that mean to you?
That's a good question. I would say, stable recovery, right? I was lucky. And I know I've heard this on other podcasts, other people have shared that, the obsession to keep using, thoughts and cravings of using didn't hang on with me for a long time. Like, probably within that first year, I had stopped dreaming about it. That's the thing that happens to us, is we have these dreams that, oh no, we got loaded. We bought a bottle, we drank it, and then we try to keep it a secret and don't tell anyone. So it probably within that first year, the urge or the thoughts, the chronic thoughts of using substances finally left me, where it just wasn't something I thought about all the time. Mind you, I did change everything in my life. I changed the people I hung out with. I got a new group of friends and they were all in recovery. And I had to avoid situations where I was gonna, at that time you couldn't buy booze in the grocery store, but I didn't hang out in bars. I didn't go dancing. We had some sober type things that we did, dances and things like that. And I was young, so I did want to go and listen to music and be a young person, but I couldn't afford to be around using. That was way too tempting for me for the first many years, probably the first 5 years. And I would feel uncomfortable if I was around it. Not so much because I wanted to use it, but it reminded me of who I was. And it was not a pretty sight for me to look back there. I hadn't healed that yet. So I think to answer your question, I probably started to feel a little more stable in the first couple of years. And by 5 years, I felt like, it would take I remember saying it would take a lot to force me back out there, because at that point I started to have relationships that were meaningful, and I started to be able to be involved with my family again. And I had become very isolated, and I didn't have a big group of friends, and I didn't have any connections with my family. I had pushed everybody away and was very, very alone when I first started my recovery journey. So, life started to open up, and having meaningful connections was what I longed for. So, yeah, I think there was a great sense of gratitude, realizing that I'm not constantly thinking about using. Such a relief and big freedom, because that feels like a ball and chain.
Did you find it difficult to, I know we've talked a couple times in other episodes where people were concerned about being able to still live their life, and still have fun, so to speak. Did you find that to be different for you?
I did. Like I said, I surrounded myself with other people that were young and doing what I was doing. And we had, in the fellowships, there are activities that, groups put together to bring people in recovery together to do social things together, whether it was like gratitude dinners where we would have a potluck dinner and have speakers, and then after that, maybe a dance. And so, yeah, there was a lot of activities like that I could get myself involved in. And, I'm a bit of an introvert, as you know. So, I probably don't need that as much as some people do, but I needed that core group, maybe 5 or 6 people that were my closest people that I could rely on, that when I was struggling and going through something difficult, I could go to and talk to about my issues. And that's a whole new lifestyle thing, because in active addiction, I was certainly not talking to people about my problems. Like I said, in total isolation. If there was something bad going on, I wasn't sharing it with anyone.
Yeah.
So was, that the therapeutic process, working with a clinician and combining that with having a sponsor in 12-step recovery and doing the step work that we do in recovery, those two things combined helped me sort of begin to heal. My thoughts weren't right about what normal life is supposed to be like. I hadn't even developed normally because I started using when I was 13 years old. So my emotional development was delayed, and I had a lot of growing up to do. Even though I was young when it started, I had to repair a lot of that thinking and the mindset that I grew up with that was so distorted. Like I didn't grow up around normal relationship between a man and a woman. My parents had a really dysfunctional relationship. They didn't communicate well. They didn't communicate much at all. And not, at least not in front of us kids. And so all of that, I didn't know how to be in the world and do relationships. I didn't know how to problem solve in relationships. So if I had problems in a friendship, I didn't know how to confront or how to express myself. So I had to learn all of that. And I'm still learning. Still learning how to do this thing called life.
What does recovery look like for you today?
Well, I'm still involved in 12-step recovery. I still go to meetings regularly, which at least once a week. I have a home group and I attend that home group online. After COVID, a lot of us went to the online meeting format and it stuck. It met a need that we had long had in the fellowship for, people who are in remote locations a long ways from meetings, or maybe they're not well and they can't travel very well. We connected. Within weeks of being shut down with COVID, we learned how to connect on Zoom and continue having meetings. And they told us we couldn't go to the churches that we used to meet at anymore. We're like, oh, that's okay. We'll figure out a way, and so that's still a part of my regular routine. My home group meeting meets online every Saturday night, and that's all my friends, everyone who knows me knows where I'll be at 7:00 Pacific Standard Time on Saturday night. And so I chair that meeting. I, do service work with the NA fellowship, which basically is just volunteering to be a part of the structure that keeps our meetings going. And I sponsor women. I've been sponsoring women since I had about 5 years in recovery. And right now I have 3 women that I sponsor. I just lost a sponsee just this last year. Had health complications as a result of her early using, and she'd been in recovery about 20 years when she died. So, and then the rest of what my recovery looks like is, again, I'm still on a healing path. Like, recovery is ongoing. It's something that I work on a daily basis. When we first got started today, I was talking about my meditation practice that I've incorporated, and I'm very consistent about that. I can't say that I've always been consistent about having a meditation practice, but I have one now. And something I started doing when I was in early recovery, and it's the one thing that I can say I'm actually really good at, is practicing gratitude. And it's a recovery principle. You know, I had a sponsor that was a stickler for, give me 5 things, give me 10 things. And they can't be the same 10 things you gave me yesterday. And so learning to practice gratitude has been a big part of my recovery, and it's still it's part of who I am, and it helped to sort of retrain my brain and how my brain thinks. So it's, also very spiritual. I'm not a religious person, but I have sort of a drive inside me to look for what makes sense in the spiritual realm, and how I connect with that differs. It's one of my favorite ways to connect with my spirituality is just to be outside in nature. And that's a big part of my recovery as well, is recognizing that, there's something bigger than me that's got something in mind for me. And that as long as I stay connected to that, I'm more likely to find my meaning and purpose in life. And for the last number of years, probably the last at least 10, maybe 15 years, that has been to serve others and to show up for other people that are struggling with addiction and that are looking for a path to recovery, and helping them find that. And that's something that we're all you've probably noticed this in your recordings with people, that we're all very compelled to be of service and help others who are looking for some hope. And, you don't have to ask us to do that work. It's sort of innate, like we want to. And it's not a rescue complex. It's not that at all. It's realizing that active addiction causes major suffering, and that there is an answer to it. And it's probably not as hard as you might think it is. And the rewards are worth every penny and worth every bit of effort.
What would you say to someone who might be trying to decide if they should seek help and why they should even bother seeking help?
Well, I would say that if you have the same disease that I have, that it wants you dead. And so the alternative is that there's a long, slow, painful path that ends in destruction with addiction. There's just no 2 ways to slice that. And it's progressive, and over time, it will destroy everything that matters to you, including you. And so if that's the path you're on and you want off, I would say there's a way out. And I don't ever tell anyone that it's easy, because it's not easy. It's not complicated though either. And so I would tell them that recovery is possible, and that this is a treatable disease, and that it requires daily maintenance, and may, for some, require a stint at detox and then inpatient treatment, maybe more than once. And I think some of that is the psychoeducational stuff that you'll learn it's kind of like if you're diagnosed with a condition that's maybe not curable, let's say it's a chronic condition. It could kill you if you don't treat it, but there's treatment available. And when that happens, the best thing you can do is become educated on what you need to do to ensure that you're treating your disease. And this is no different, just like a diabetic or someone with a heart condition. So understand and know what the treatment is. And first and foremost, for me, that's complete abstinence. Like there's bottom line behavior there is that I cannot use minor mood altering substances. And if I'm in a situation where I have to have a surgery, for example, and have to use medication, I have to do that very carefully and make sure that I have someone helping me administer and manage medication, because my addiction doesn't care if it comes from a doctor or a guy on the street or in a bottle. My addiction doesn't care. And so I think I answered that question. I would tell them that there is hope and that they can stop and they can change, and that it won't be easy, but it's worth it. Your life is worth it.
Those are all the questions I have. And I know there are some that you probably wanted to make sure you mentioned during this episode. So if there's anything else to add, what would you add?
Well, I think what I wish people knew about recovery that I think they may not is that life doesn't end when we stop using the party substance, right? I mean, I think that in our culture, we're trained to think that that's how you have fun. And, that's true in our agency too, right? We're taught that that's how you let loose. That's how you relax. That's how you have fun. And, sadly for a lot of us, we get on board. We're like, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's go do that. Well, for some of us, and for some it happens sooner than later, the fun stops being fun. We can still show up, but, we're doing things, we're behaving in ways that other people are, looking at like, wow, people start looking down their nose at the way that we use, and consequences start happening. We start getting arrested, and suddenly our kids and our husbands and our wives don't want to talk to us anymore. And, maybe we're in trouble at work. Maybe we're not reliable. Maybe people are smelling booze on us at work. Once that starts to happen, it's not fun. And whether a person is acting like they're ashamed or not, trust me, they're ashamed. And they know that what they're doing is not like other people. And I think it's helpful to know that we wish we could be like other people. It's no different than someone with a mental health condition that has to take medication. We wish so much that we didn't need to take medication, that we could just be like other people. It's too bad I can't drink like a lady, and behave myself. But I can't, and I don't. And so I guess what I would say is that while it's really difficult to stop those patterns in the beginning and to learn a new way of life, once you've done that, it's way easier than what I used to do. It's way easier than trying to make sure that my secrets are secure, and that, like trying to remember who I told what. And because, I was not a very honest person. I was always hiding, and it's so much easier to not live like that, to just be free and to be proud of who I am, to be able to look in the mirror and not be ashamed of myself. Oh my God, the relief that gives me. I would not trade that. And for me to return to wanting to numb out, even for an evening, is just not worth what I would lose. Because I gained, I started out not having much self-esteem at all. And I gained this sense of myself and this freedom to care for me and to have beautiful relationships with other people. I wouldn't trade that. And that's what I would have to look forward to if I return to my old way.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Living in Recovery. If you or someone you know needs help, reach out to the Employee Assistance Program to reach a licensed clinician at 1-800-755-7002. For additional resources related to the Alcohol and Substance Misuse Prevention Program, please visit the CBP Workforce Care Directorate page on CBPNet. You can also send questions directly to CBP Resiliency at cbp.dhs.gov.